Hey everyone. One of the most popular political commentary channels of 2024 on YouTube was Piers Morgan Uncensored. Although that title might make you think it's the most disturbing OnlyFans page on the planet, it's actually a show that is ostensibly about interesting figures debating important political issues. At the time of me writing this, it's sitting at a little over 3.5 million subscribers and uploads new videos each weekday, each one regularly garnering over 1 million views. So it's doing pretty good. And I wanted to take a look at what this channel was like. Piers Morgan is a British broadcaster who started his career in 1988 working at the British tabloid The Sun. From there, he's been seeing himself work for a number of different outlets, such as the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail. Here's a taste of what young Piers Morgan was like back when he appeared on a TV show in the mid-90s.
Is the answer jam?
Not in so many words.
Because last week Eddie Izzard said everybody roared with laughter. I think it was hilarious. I just thought I'd say.
But people like him.
There's a long list of scummy stuff he has allegedly done in the UK that really can't fit in this one video. But I've linked a few articles if you want to read more about how terrible he was there. Morgan started marketing himself in the United States instead, and he appeared on television programs America's Got Talent and The Apprentice, the latter of which he won. He notably was given Larry King's old time slot at CNN to launch his own show, Piers Morgan Live, but the show only lasted a few years before it was canceled due to poor ratings. In 2015, he started co-hosting Good Morning Britain on ITV, until he got a little too much heat after accusing Meghan Markle of lying in her interview with Oprah Winfrey, and he left the program. From there, he would go to the newly launched Talk TV channel to start Piers Morgan Uncensored, which began airing in April of 2022. At first, its format was very similar to other cable news shows, opening with editorials by Piers Morgan and interviews with several guests. Very early on, it would start emphasizing its interviews, and gradually it would start bringing in high-profile guests such as YouTube commentators. It also had a healthy dose of goofy stunts, with videos that had titles like Piers Morgan eats yogurt in front of vegan in heated debate over hypocritical advert. In February of 2024, Morgan moved the program entirely to YouTube, taking it off Talk TV entirely. Instead of posting brief clips, entire episodes would now be featured on the online platform. The long and short-form interviews would continue, but a greater emphasis started to be placed on panel discussions, and the show started gaining a reputation for shouting matches and interruptions.
When you all talk over each other, nobody can hear you.
I'm talking.
Sorry, can I just please have a moment of quiet?
I'm mostly focusing on what was uploaded on this channel in November of 2024, because those are the most recent videos that are available, and I thought it would be a fair way of looking at what this channel is like in the current moment. The first thing you'll see after clicking on any of these videos is a teaser of the spiciest moments of the program.
The whiny liberal woman turned away so many would-be Democrat voters.
That's me playing the world's smallest violin for all these crying Democrats.
You deserve a tall glass of shut up juice.
I don't think Sarah McBride is looking to shower next to Nancy Mason.
If I found you lurking next to me in a men's restroom, I'd feel fearful.
Some of that doesn't really seem like thoughtful debate. Anyone familiar with YouTube will probably recognize this technique though. It's usually done on channels where streams are cut up into clips, letting people know that there will be some good stuff coming later in the video, even if the videos start off with something really boring. Each video begins with a monologue from Piers about the video's first topic. Usually it's not very long, and he throws to some clips before introducing his guests, and it's here where the show really starts to kick into gear. Cable news shows typically have a mix of journalists, politicians, academics, and other high-profile public figures. Piers Morgan's show does that as well, though it also includes on its panel a healthy supply of people with popular online programs, frequently those already appearing on YouTube. It makes sense because the audiences for these people are on this platform, so if you're interested in catching people's attention, it makes sense to highlight popular voices in this space. The quality of these guests is very inconsistent. While there are some genuinely interesting voices on there, the show often includes cranks who have little to add to the topics being discussed. One extreme example is poker player Dan Bilzerian, who was brought on to discuss the Israeli attack on Gaza, but this devolved into clear and obvious anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
I believe that Jewish supremacy is the greatest threat to America, and I think it's the greatest threat to the world today. I truly believe that.
Piers Morgan does push back, but it's not very forceful.
It sounds to me, Dan, like you do actually hate Jewish people.
Yeah, I think he does too. Eventually, Piers calls this guy a Nazi, but only after giving Bilzerian room to spew some really hateful stuff. When he was called out on the interview the next day, Piers Morgan responded like this.
At least when I interview somebody with incendiary views, audiences get to see those views being vigorously challenged.
I'm not trying to suggest Piers Morgan is anti-Semitic. Rather, I think this reflects a problem in how this show is booked. It's bad enough to invite a Nazi onto your show, but to only find out they're a Nazi in the middle of the interview is ridiculous.
Well, I think most of the problems today is caused by Jewish supremacy. I believe that.
I'm honestly gobsmacked that you would say all this publicly.
Piers Morgan Uncensored will invite on pretty much anyone with a following, regardless of any value their insight might bring to a subject. In the case of Bilzerian, he was initially brought on to discuss the devastation of Gaza, a spot that could have been taken by someone who truly cares about the Palestinian people and their cause, and isn't just a hateful bigot exploiting the tragedy to advance an anti-Semitic agenda. But even before a word came out of his mouth, what qualifies a professional poker player to have an opinion worth hearing about on this subject? The only thing Piers Morgan cited was a lot of followers on Instagram. If someone really wanted to learn about the situation in Gaza, there are much better voices. I should point out that some of those voices have appeared on this program, and that's great, but Bilzerian wasn't some bizarre one-off or fluke. A less extreme example of this is how noted plagiarist Benny Johnson was being offered a spot on the panel to talk about Russia, and specifically its invasion of Ukraine. Not once did they bring up the fact that Johnson had unknowingly taken millions of dollars from the Russian government to produce his program, something that makes him, at best, a useful idiot for Moscow. I'm not saying you can never invite some of these people onto your program, but the idea of bringing on a guest is that they bring some level of knowledge or expertise on a subject. And if you wanted to interview Benny Johnson on a subject he knows something about, maybe ask him how he was able to plagiarize over 40 different articles at BuzzFeed before they found out and fired him. Many of these guests, particularly those on the right, aren't really there to argue anything they've seriously considered or studied, but rather they're there to toe a certain line and advance a well-established agenda. In the video titled, "Wicked is the Ninth Circle of Hell, Liberals Triggered," plus bizarre woke Jaguar ad, YouTube creator Nerdrotic is brought into a surprisingly thoughtful conversation about Ed Sheeran, who said he didn't want to be part of the 40th anniversary edition of the Live Aid charity classic, Do They Know It's Christmas? Sheeran felt that the imagery used by the song perpetuates a negative image of African people. Although the subject isn't terribly important, the panel was surprisingly thoughtful when it comes to how an entire continent is understood in popular culture and the importance of not stereotyping it as a place of perpetual poverty.
In the midst of this act of kindness trying to solve a short-term crisis, we've created another crisis, which is the identity crisis, where for me, growing up in the UK, these kind of images really affected me to the point where I disconnected with being African. I was not proud of being African.
Nerdrotic's contribution is an outlier, though, and it's less than stellar.
I think there's a reasonable conclusion we could come here. We could talk about the region maybe and not, because there's shithole countries. Definitely. It's not exclusive to Africa. There's shithole countries around the entire world.
The more obvious compromise would be to listen to the people from Africa on how they would like their respective communities to be portrayed. But as obnoxious as this guy is, I don't really blame him for having such a poor response. Of course he would fumble and bumble about this issue. In that very video, he said he was primarily concerned with Star Wars and Marvel movies being attacked by whatever he thinks wokeness is supposed to mean. I'd be amazed if this was an issue he even thought about before he found out it was a topic that very day. But he does have a channel with over 1 million subscribers, so Piers Morgan has invited him on to opine about Jaguar ads and 40-year-old charity songs. Not every guest is an odious bigot or empty-headed grifter, and I'll highlight a few of the better ones later in the video, but Piers Morgan Uncensored doesn't seem to have any quality control for its guest. It's more concerned with attracting attention regardless of how it gets it and what people it platforms, all while using news commentary as a cover. Piers Morgan Uncensored is very much about the theater of debate. And while I'm generally pro-theater, most conversations on this YouTube channel are devoid of substance and depth, and quickly devolve into crosstalk and dunking. The crosstalk in particular is very annoying, replicating the worst of cable news panels where all the guests are doing their best to make sure they get as much voice time as possible.
Not only, not at all, not at all.
Can I just come back on? Do you support then the targeted assassination of 188?
I'll tell you.
How do they afford to?
They don't have one penny of accountability.
I'll come to you.
Not one penny of accountability.
Like FARA violations. You're telling me the FARA violations of him illegally accepting foreign money, of him taking bribes and having money go that the statute of limitations is what?
Don't talk over each other, please.
In the midst of all this noise, we sometimes get the main attraction in these debates, the dunks. For those who don't know what a dunk is, it's when someone uses rhetoric to make someone else look silly in a conversation.
But I'm not going to stand for
brother,
personal
you got it wrong.
Say
you were
whatever
preposterously and stupidly wrong. So, okay, all right. Can I just finish a goddamn thought?
That Donald Trump will be able to go in and replace career civil servants with political appointees.
Okay. You sound like a sore loser, Brian.
How much you enjoy these moments will depend on how much you like or dislike the commentators involved. And while it is basically all team sports, occasionally you'll get a special moment, such as the rarest of dunks, the self-dunk. For one of those, we have to go to the king, Dave Rubin, who proves that no one is better on dunking on Dave Rubin than Dave Rubin.
But if you had a 14-year-old girl and she was a wrestler, would you be okay? Yes or no? No other words. Yes or no? Would you be okay with her wrestling a 14-year-old boy?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I wrestled for a decade and men and women wrestle together. That's how it works.
Please stop advocating this.
And while all of this is good fun to watch, what exactly is the point of it? Sure, it shows Dave Rubin to be an empty vessel of a man, but Rubin has been proving that on his YouTube channel for years. This panel in particular is a collection of clippable moments that punctuate an otherwise pointless conversation, right down to the title of the video. You're such a smug prick, Dave Rubin versus David Pakman, and more, which references a moment where David Pakman called out Dave Rubin for taking money from Russia.
When Dave Rubin talks about well-funded this or that, his Russian money source just dried up, and he's the last person who should be talking about funding sources.
These moments are why this channel is so popular. The titles, thumbnails, and little sizzle reel that opens up each video highlight them because that's what everyone is here to see. This is ostensibly designed to attract people to more substantive debates, letting them know you're going to see some really funny, messed up stuff happen, but if you stick around, a richer conversation will also be happening. Except that never happens. On the rare case a serious or substantive discussion starts, it often is stopped right in its tracks by one of the panel members interrupting someone, or everything coming to a screeching halt when someone lands a dunk. All any of this noise really does is let people cheer for their respective sides. This has long been a problem of these political debates online, as audiences have been trained to listen for these clippable moments, and participants have followed in suit. Piers Morgan Uncensored isn't unique in that sense, but it is an example of how this internet culture of messy debates has been given this sleek corporate sheen to recreate the noise of that space. In a way, it reflects how the YouTube space changes the creation of some online weirdos and twists it into this corporatized version that's designed to maximize profits by getting high-profile guests to roll in the mud because there's big money to be made in this kind of spectacle. Something inescapable from these conversations is that they're invariably positioned to favor one side of the political spectrum, and that's very clearly the right. While this often comes from the guests who are included in the panel, much of it also comes from the topics that are chosen and how they're presented. Here's how Piers Morgan introduces a discussion on the recent cabinet picks for the incoming Trump administration.
Trump is doing exactly what he said he'd do if he got elected. And he just won the presidency in an emphatic clean sweep. If that's not a mandate for him to now do what he said he'd do, then what is?
And the first guest Piers Morgan goes to is comedian Vincent Oshana, who rattles off some scattered thoughts while building to the whole point of this ramble.
And you know what this is, Piers? This right here, can you guys see that on the camera? That's me playing the world's smallest violin for all these crying Democrats.
It's sad that, even with notes to help him, Oshana can't really say anything positive about the Trump cabinet nominations, aside from two of them being veterans. He does spend several minutes listing all the flaws with the previous cabinet, which is fine, but when he can't provide a positive argument for his side, he reveals he's not much more than an attack dog, only really suited to shouting matches, which is why he's there. The merits of the choices matter less than criticizing the previous administration and dunking on the left, and that dunk line Oshana had at the end is what makes him a favorite for this program. While the state of conservative commentary is pretty dire, it's not as if it's impossible to find a conservative guest who can at least speak to a topic without sounding ridiculous. In fact, this program managed to find someone on that very same panel with Richard W. Painter, who was a chief White House ethics lawyer under the George W. Bush administration. He is at least capable of talking about an issue while sounding like an adult.
Now, I do hope that instead of talking on and on about Russia and 2016 and so forth, and the 2020 election and all of that, that the president-elect, when he becomes president, can focus on policy. Reason why these corporations have so much influence in Republican and Democratic administrations is people are not taking the ethics laws seriously.
That's all expressed very sensibly, and Piers Morgan builds off that response to ask a general question about corruption. Oshana's response reveals his ability to engage with the topic.
No, I agree 100%, Piers. You know what I think it is? I think the left has Stockholm syndrome, Piers. They have fallen in love with their abuser, and now they're defending the abuser.
Unsurprisingly, he changed the subject to dump on the left, because that's the full extent of his ability to do political commentary. Maybe it's too much to expect a comedian to have anything interesting to say about cabinet positions, but once again, the fault of that mostly lies with the show inviting him on as if he has anything worthwhile to contribute to that specific conversation. His expertise and analysis matters far less than his ability to attack. While the majority of videos devolve into messy shouting matches, I should mention a handful do settle into more cordial conversations. These are often around topics where the guests either mostly agree or don't have strong differences in their opinions. One example is, Diddy update could be witness tampering? Is he making moves from jail? Although I'm not terribly familiar with the story or the panelists, they did actually discuss things in a civil manner, and things didn't devolve into annoying shouting matches. When there were interruptions, they went more like this.
But they would give somebody like Michael Jeffries bail, 10 million or something like that, correct?
I couldn't agree with you more.
An interesting fact about this video, though, was by far it had the lowest number of views for the month of November. I'm not sure if it's because of the subject or the guests didn't have much of an appeal to the regular audience, but I suspect the lack of fireworks in the opening 30 seconds might have something to do with why audiences were not so keen on this video. And for those who don't know, YouTube only counts views for anyone who watches more than 30 seconds of a video. So if someone clicked onto a video and didn't like what they saw in the first 30 seconds, if they stop playing the video, they won't be counted as a view. The explanation for the theatrics and right-wing slant of the show go right back to its host, Piers Morgan. When you watch multiple videos from this channel, you start to get a sense of the patterns Morgan has when it comes to engaging in any political discussion. He's more than happy to sit back and watch guests tear into one another, and he obviously sets the stage with how he presents each topic. But even more important is how he's constantly emphasizing certain topics in each episode. For example, and I can't stress this enough, the man is obsessed with trans athletes in sports.
I've constantly said this is something most people really feel fired up about, which is this thing of trans athletes in women's sport and so on, and getting into women's spaces and so on. Transgender athletes in women's sport and the very damaging impact that is having. I really think they underestimated how the majority of Americans feel about that kind of thing. They also were supporting things like transgender athletes being allowed to compete in women's sport.
As a reminder, since we always need one whenever this topic comes up, the issue of trans athletes in sports is a moral panic cooked up by the right. Not only is it not a major issue on the left, it's also the latest in a long line of fear-mongering campaigns against trans people, a campaign the right has been waging for many years. Not only is this a non-issue that affects a tiny percentage of people, it's also not, as Piers Morgan repeatedly stated in these videos, infringing on the rights of cisgendered women. Last I checked, they were still very much allowed to play sports. And they still seem to be doing pretty well, as the supposed dominance of trans athletes has yet to manifest. Not that Piers Morgan would know that, as he repeatedly cites this stat that 900 medals have been awarded to trans athletes. This came from a United Nations report, though not in quite the way he imagines it. Piers Morgan first brought up this stat when speaking to David Pakman in an October video where he called it a survey.
An astonishing survey has just come out today by the United Nations that reveals that female athletes have lost 900 medals to transgender rivals competing against them in women's sporting categories. This is a UN report.
The report isn't a survey like Piers Morgan first presented it. The section on medals is a few sentences sourced from an anti-trans advocacy group and doesn't represent research from the UN. Specifically, this stat comes from a website called shewon.org. There's a giant table that counts the number of medals that have supposedly been won. Apparently it's gone up since that UN report, but you'll notice there's a big asterisk next to it. And it reveals that it's not just medals, but rather records, scholarships, and other opportunities. It not only covers sports around the world, but it goes back to 2001. But we can look at this stat and be unreasonably generous and say that there are 1,055 medals that trans athletes have won that would otherwise have gone to cisgendered people. But out of how many medals is that in total? I couldn't possibly tell you how many medals are awarded in just 1 year around the world for all sports. For example, at the recent Paris Olympics, there were 329 events, each awarding 3 medals. That's 987 medals. And that's not counting all the additional medals that go to team sports. The total is actually over 2,000 athletes being awarded medals, and that's only looking at the highest levels of competition for these particular sports. Many of these sports have competitions throughout the year in a number of different countries. The total number of medals that are handed out every year in sporting events is probably at least in the hundreds of thousands. That's why this stat is nonsense. Without a total to weigh it against, you actually can't use it to support the idea that trans athletes are performing better than cisgendered athletes. Also, looking at this list more closely, you start to notice some weird patterns, like so many of these incidents are for disc golf. Over 200, in fact. With all this talk about how trans athletes are dominating sports and endangering cisgendered women, I didn't think 1/5 of that danger was coming from the disc golf scene. Many of these supposed medals are also being counted more than once. If a trans athlete finishes first in a minor golf tournament, the second, third, and fourth place athletes will all be counted. This is an example of how one trans athlete winning anything is counted 3 times in this list, which is another way in which this total is deeply suspect. But none of these details, of course, matter to Piers Morgan. After Pacman confronted him on this stat, we got a rare fact check on the show where Morgan's team pulls up the UN report.
The replacement of the female sports category with a mixed sex category has resulted in an increasing number of female athletes losing opportunities, including medals, when competing against males, the report said. So, David, again, would you like to now apologise for being not only wrong about this being an election issue, but being wrong about your correction when I asked you if you were sorry for being wrong?
Look at the underlying source, Piers. I have it printed out.
You said it was
in
a footnote.
The other room.
It wasn't a
Look
footnote.
at the underlying source.
This is the heart of pedantry. Piers Morgan is arguing that the stat is in the body of the report and not a footnote, whereas Pacman is arguing that the stat is sourced through a footnote and not evidenced by the report itself, and therefore shouldn't be credited to the UN. This isn't a fact check. This is a waste of time. Also, this report wasn't conducted by the United Nations, but rather a special rapporteur for the UN, that is, an independent expert who is providing advice to the United Nations. This individual is Reem Al-Salem, a well-known anti-trans activist. And how she became a special rapporteur for the UN is outside the scope of this humble little video. Another talking point that Piers Morgan loves to bring up is that he thinks trans rights were one of the issues that cost the Democrats the 2024 election in the US.
A lot of it was down to the economy, a lot of it was down to the immigration crisis, but a lot of it was also down to what is perceived to be just woke insanity, including this whole trans debate.
Of course, Piers Morgan considers himself a liberal on this issue, as he said in another video.
This is all stuff that, as a liberal guy, which I am, I'm completely in favour of. So if I am, so I can tell you, are the majority of Americans.
Anyone familiar with Piers Morgan's output in Britain is probably having a good laugh over this because he has a long history of working with conservative outlets. But I want to put that to the side for a moment so we can instead focus on this for just a little bit, because I think Piers Morgan's attitudes towards trans issues in general is a great example of how this concept of being a liberal can exist in someone's mind when rather it should manifest in someone's actions. Going back to the video where Morgan and Pacman squared off, there was a trans person who was invited to join this panel, Brianna Wu. While it's nice to see an actual trans person on to talk about issues that affect them and their community, Wu's role here is to advocate for Piers Morgan and feed the narrative of trans activists run amok.
10 years ago, Janet Mock on CNN, you held an interview with her. We were not talking about trans stuff back then. Everyone in the community was thrilled about it. What did she do? She went on your program. She lectured you. She was beyond rude. She told you she was not interested in your opinion on anything. She just shut you down.
I said that she was born a boy and then transitioned to be a trans woman. She said that that was transphobic and tried to basically destroy me. And that right there was the start of this nonsense.
For those too young to remember this moment, Wu is completely mischaracterizing this moment in history. First of all, there were 2 interviews. The first of which was incredibly cordial, and both Piers Morgan and Janet Mock were very kind to one another in it.
So I'm seeing a bit of Janet and a bit of Beyonce, especially with the hair.
Oh, I live for Beyonce. No,
and the dress, because this is very like the dress Beyonce wore when I interviewed her. Not that I can remember every second of that day.
This interview was held back in 2014. 10 years later, we would all be a little bit more savvy on trans issues and not use terms such as born a boy, and instead use assigned male at birth. There was also one point in the interview when Morgan asked, "How would you feel if you found out the woman you were dating was formerly a man, when Mock had never identified as a man?"
You meet a man, and you fall in love with this man, but there's something you have to tell him. Something pretty big you have to tell him that he doesn't know, which is that you used to be yourself a man. After the break, we'll find out how you told him that news and how he took it.
A few days later, there was a bit of rudeness from Mock when she expressed her frustration on Twitter, writing, "Was a boy until 18. Get it the f*** together. Piers Morgan, I was not formerly a man. Please stop sensationalizing my life and misgendering trans women." Morgan responded in frustration and then had Mock on for a second time for a more contentious interview, one where Mock was pretty darn polite while Morgan was far more confrontational.
So I ask you again, why have I been vilified for being transparently supportive of you? I don't get it.
Maybe you don't get it because you're not a trans woman. Trans women
explain to me. Explain to me what I did wrong. What did I do wrong?
You called, so before commercial break, we had a lovely conversation, and then all of a sudden you said, "Who was formerly a man." I was a baby. I was assigned male gender because of the appearance of my genitals.
I think it's a fair criticism to say that Mock could have been more vocal during the first interview, but her explanation as to why she was silent makes sense. And being from a marginalized community, she didn't get many opportunities to share her story.
Why didn't you correct me at the time? Why didn't you correct me?
I did not because I was
scared.
If
you felt that strongly?
I did not because I was scared. And I wanted to be a cordial guest. And I think that that was probably incorrect of me. I wanted to be kind, I wanted to be generous because I was appreciative of having 2 segments on a mainstream show.
Expressing displeasure on Twitter isn't great, though the backlash Piers Morgan got clearly upset him. I'm not sure how powerful that backlash could have been on a tweet with less than 1,000 likes, but it was 2014, and when you think you're doing something good, it can feel jarring to find out you've made some kind of mistake and people on social media have noticed. Throughout the second interview, Morgan constantly identifies himself as an ally, and I suspect, in a way, he does believe that. But allyship isn't an identity you can claim, it's the actions you take. And when someone within the community you think you're speaking for tells you you're doing it wrong, the onus is on you to listen. I imagine it would have been nicer to get an email rather than being put on blast in a tweet, but Piers Morgan has been working in the media for decades at this point, and he should have thicker skin than this. What we can learn from this episode is how anti-trans mindsets are created in people who identify as allies, rather than take a moment of self-reflection to consider what they may have said was not helpful towards a marginalized group. It's far easier for someone to center themselves in the conversation and focus on the angriest voices calling them out for that misstep. And once you center yourself as the object of scorn and people within that community as the abusive ones, it's a very easy jump to see any minor issue as some kind of grand overreach by rabid activists. The same ones who, at least according to the persecuted person, tried to cancel them for comments that they think were perfectly fine. And that's how someone who considers themselves an ally can find themselves on the side of anti-trans bigots, using wedge issues like sports to diminish support for the trans community. You might have noticed I went from talking about Piers Morgan to using the broader term them or they. It's not because people on the left love pronouns. I personally love all units of language. Because one very concerning thing about this change in mindset is how by modeling it, Piers Morgan creates the impression that this could happen to anyone. That one misstep could lead to cancellation and the end of your life. But I have some great news for anyone who genuinely worries about this. And I cannot stress enough how happy you should be about this. You are not Piers Morgan. you won't be held to that same standard. And the odds of someone writing a mean tweet about you after you accidentally use the wrong term in a conversation is incredibly small. Most trans people don't have the time or interest to put someone on blast for minor slip-ups like that. Even if someone did put you on blast, it's likely they don't have enough of a platform to destroy your life. And let's be real, Piers Morgan's life was not destroyed or damaged in any considerable way. Yes, his CNN show was eventually canceled, but it's not because he was rude to a trans guest. It was because he had bad ratings. And now he's got a popular YouTube channel. Instead of being a professional in the media space and accepting the criticism, even if it's not ideally presented, and simply moving on, Piers Morgan has decided to accept it as some kind of origin story of activists going too far. It's easier and more profitable to do something like that instead of taking a moment of self-reflection and consider maybe you got something wrong. And Piers Morgan is hardly the first person to play this game. Of course, trans issues aren't the only thing Piers talks about on his show that betrays sympathy for the right. One talking point he loved trotting out following the election was that Democrats were just too extreme in their rhetoric towards Donald Trump, particularly using the words fascist and Nazi.
So when the left try and take the high moral ground about lying, I say, what about you lot, who called Trump Hitler for 8 years?
The comparison here, on its face, is ridiculous. When talking about how Donald Trump lies as an individual, Piers Morgan pivots to position the entire left in opposition. Why does an entire side of the political spectrum have to be weighed against one man? When it comes to calling someone Hitler, it's trivial to find examples of people on the right doing the exact same thing to Joe Biden and Barack Obama. And yes, people on the left certainly said the same about George W. Bush. But Piers Morgan apparently believes this is a new thing, and one the entire left now has to answer for. It's especially silly when he gets upset over the use of the term fascist, which Donald Trump has used to describe the left in his speeches.
And she's calling them all fascists and Nazis, okay? But she's a fascist, okay? She's a fascist.
Morgan would argue that it's better to ignore what Trump says as we should judge him on his actions.
And he does this brilliantly, by the way, with the left. He sucks you in. Because he just shoots from the hip and he says stuff that crosses his mind or whatever. And rather than pick him off on stuff he actually does, you all go completely nuts every time he opens his mouth and says something a bit crazy.
I hope the double standard here is clear. Democrats are judged on the rhetoric of anyone on the left, but Donald Trump is never held accountable for any of his rhetoric. As for the generous use of the term fascist, it's something Morgan has no problem when he does it himself.
The left would constantly say Trump's a fascist, whilst themselves behaving very like fascists. You know, the purest personification of fascism is where a group of people tell another group of people, if you don't dress how we tell you to, speak how we tell you to, laugh at things that we think are acceptable, you know, have heroes that we have approved, read books that we have approved, etc., etc., that is actually what fascism is. It's where you try through your own narrow prism of your worldview, try and dictate that to everybody else on pain of utter cancellation.
There are a lot of bad definitions for fascism out there, but publicly shaming a person is maybe the softest version I've ever heard. Finding contradictions to the various signifiers that Piers Morgan say are a part of fascism are pretty easy to do on the right as well. Whether it's people getting upset over clothing when it's someone in drag, or people getting upset over someone sharing their pronouns, or entitled comedians insisting people should be laughing at their stale material. It's also completely laughable to complain about trying to control what people can read when states like Republican-led Tennessee are banning literature such as The Time Machine, The Tempest, and the 34th volume of Bleach. Of all these random examples, the only one that has the echo of fascism is the book banning, as historically that is something fascist governments have done. People telling someone their joke sucks or getting upset over offensive language is worlds away from a government enforcing humor or speech standards. People across the political spectrum get worked up over cultural issues, and some are very loud about how upset they are. The only way that can be equated to fascism is if Piers Morgan reduces the term to meaning something so broad and vague, he can apply it to people that he finds politically repulsive. And funnily enough, he only does that to people on the left. These are just a few examples of how Piers Morgan will uncritically repeat anti-left talking points while emphasizing stories that are publicized and popularized on the right. And yet Morgan has insisted many times on his show that he is not on the right.
I'm not even vaguely right, and I think it's wrong that biological men who've become trans women should be in women's spaces.
You're not vaguely right, Piers?
When Piers Morgan describes himself as a centrist, I can almost think he believes it. Not because he's carefully weighed the issues and simply happens to find himself cupped between the left and the right, but rather because he doesn't really have any firm politics. He is simply saying and doing whatever he needs to get attention on the internet. And when it comes to YouTube, there's no easier ploy than appealing to a right-wing audience with the video equivalent of junk food. One genuinely good thing I did see Piers Morgan include on his show was the open discussions about the situation in Gaza, bringing on guests who would actively advocate for the Palestinian people. These guests were often countered by pro-Israel voices, but instead of seeing Piers Morgan frequently take the side of the right, he was a bit more even-handed, offering challenges to both.
Again, we come back to the media being banned from going in there. If you don't let the media in, then I'm afraid as a journalist, I'm like, what are they hiding?
Yeah.
My question was, where should the Gazan civilians go to be safe?
The Gazan civilians today have an opportunity after Hamas
No, that's not my
that
question.
has subjugated them
No, you can't.
to rebuild their
Fine,
society.
that wasn't my question. My question is, where can they currently go to be safe?
To the safe spaces that Israel has assigned, where Israel is not attacking.
Where?
Well, it depends where.
That being said, his record on the conflict is a lot less flattering, and when he brings on someone like Mehdi Hasan, it becomes very apparent how squeamish Morgan is when it comes to harsher criticisms of Israel.
It's complicated. No, it's not complicated, actually. Israel is the occupier under international law. Israel is the one killing the vast majority of civilians. Right now, it's not a liberal democracy. It's run by neo-fascists now.
Well, I don't disagree with you.
Based on his comments, it seems like Morgan simply hasn't thought about or read enough on the issue to offer anything of substance. There was a great example from another conversation he had with Mehdi Hasan on Zateo.
So the Russians are doing a genocide?
No, I don't think they are, and I shouldn't have said that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in order to defend Israel, you're withdrawing your allegation against Russia?
Yeah, because you made me think about it.
Well, it's great that Piers Morgan is willing to present people like Mehdi Hasan and other voices who will advocate for the lives of Palestinian people. This seems like a topic he should do a bit more research on before voicing his own opinion, although that's kind of par for the course with a lot of what he seems to talk about. I've been pretty harsh on Piers Morgan Uncensored as a program, but one section that wasn't completely useless were the one-on-one interviews. I've already highlighted a few examples of it at its worst, such as platforming a Nazi, and I've shown some positive examples, such as speaking with Mehdi Hasan. But unlike the panel discussions, the longer interviews are far more likely to result in something interesting being said. For example, a former advisor to Kamala Harris, Mike Nellis, was brought on to address the idea that men are being alienated by Hollywood and that one Gillette ad from 5 years ago that talked about toxic masculinity. Nellis decided to sidestep the issue and talk about something real instead.
They want to tell everybody that if they're not the type of manliness that they like, type of manliness that you see on the right, that you're not a real man. And I'm sick of that crap. Here's the truth. White men in America are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than any other group of people in the United States. I didn't hear either party talk about that.
Things fall apart when Nellis is brought onto the panel and the conversation decays rapidly. But for a few minutes, there was an interview where something interesting was being said, and the absurd narrative of men being let down by advertisements got some real pushback. The interview was contentious, but that's completely fine. Going on a show like this, you should expect to have your positions challenged. However, interviews with right-wing guests seem to include fewer of those challenges, even when someone says something completely ridiculous. For example, Glenn Beck said this about Donald Trump in an interview.
He could be a Lincoln, a transformational president as much as a Lincoln. Right. Restoring the republic.
Piers Morgan just nods along to the idea that Donald Trump will do something on par with ending slavery. I suppose deporting 20 million people would have a large-scale impact, but destroying lives and families like that seems more like the opposite of ending a monstrous institution like slavery. Even though the actual ideas expressed here are ridiculous, and Piers Morgan doesn't offer any meaningful pushback to right-wing claptrap, I do appreciate this interview because it provides a clear example of what someone like Glenn Beck thinks. A clip like that speaks for itself. So there is a kind of value to these interviews as well. These interviews also sometimes lead to us understanding Piers Morgan a little bit more when we get moments like this one.
Why didn't he behave like a fascist for 4 years when he had the chance? And the truth is he didn't. January 6th was awful, and I wrote that at the time and said it at the time. But other than that, where you could construct an argument for this was the kind of thing you would see in a sort of a banana republic, there's nothing about Trump's first term which screamed fascism to me.
Who amongst us hasn't tried to overthrow a democratic election in the past? But moments like this, I hope, make it crystal clear what side of the aisle Piers Morgan is currently servicing. and how standards aren't really upheld for one side while being overly enforced on the other. There's something interesting that happens with the occasional guest on these videos. At the tail end of one video, the streamer Destiny was brought on for a few minutes following the November election. What was ostensibly about his reaction to the Trump victory was almost certainly just an excuse to ask this question.
Complete quick clean sweep. He won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College. Did you cry?
This isn't the only time Piers Morgan has done something like this. For example, he brought on Roger Stone for this moment.
I just wanted to end on a bit of personal business, Roger, because when I tweeted that Kamala Harris wasn't up to winning the presidency, you responded to me on X and you said, Piers now trying to suck Trump's dick after betraying him previously, a truly talentless dirtbag. I just wondered whether, now the dust has settled, you wanted to maybe rethink your view there, Roger.
There's this element of humiliation in Piers Morgan's interviews that seeps to the surface that's very petty. While it's all good to hold people to account and ask challenging questions, I don't see the value in bringing someone on to a political commentary show and asking if they cried, or throwing an old tweet in their face to settle a personal grudge. In a better world, any self-respecting guest wouldn't tolerate this. But one of the reasons people do, and one of the reasons anyone goes on Piers Morgan's channel, is not because they thirst for good-spirited debate, but because he has a big audience and it's a great marketing opportunity. Piers Morgan Uncensored has become an arena for spectacle, and everyone is getting in on making the most of that attention, reveling in it in an effort to get people's attention and hopefully retain as much of that audience as possible. Even this video is part of that same problem. There's no real way to spotlight what a whole this channel is without participating in the publicity it gets. Obviously, not engaging at all isn't what I'm suggesting, otherwise this video wouldn't exist. And more power to anyone who goes to these panels and can make the most of those opportunities. But what I hope people take away from all of this is a greater awareness of what is happening on Piers Morgan Uncensored and what sort of guy is hosting it. It's a modern fusion of some old techniques, assembling loud, eye-catching figures to yell at each other and centering the conversation around a self-professed centrist who more often sides with the right. It's a reflection of the dominance the right has on YouTube, and a depressing reminder that a lot of work needs to be done to push back and undermine some of these voices. There's one last moment I want to highlight that I think reveals the depths of what this channel is. As some added context, Emma Vigeland of the Majority Report is addressing Piers Morgan's fixation on the imagined threat of trans athletes, and she suggests that he tackle more important issues, like victims of sexual assault. Piers Morgan's response really sums up this entire cynical enterprise.
I'll take your advice on what segments we should be doing. We are the fastest growing YouTube channel in the world, so we're probably getting it about right.
So long as he can keep growing his channel, demonizing trans people or pushing some other bogus right-wing narrative, he's going to keep doing just that. And I think it's very helpful when his guests call him out to his face. One thing you'll notice in this video is I didn't spend too much time talking about the various guests that Piers Morgan had on, and a big part of that is because I really wanted to talk about the show itself and Piers Morgan as a host. And while I was tempted to go on a few sidebars, I had to restrain myself. I made an exception, of course, for Dave Rubin because it was just too fun an opportunity to pass up. Speaking of fun opportunities you wouldn't want to pass up on, do consider becoming a patron for this channel or a member, and you will get early access to videos, your name in the credits like the fine folks you see here, and maybe a few extras every now and again. If you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Thank you all so much for watching.